So hello, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. So if you'll go ahead and just first introduce yourself to that camera right there.
Hi, I'm Juan Sepulveda, and I'm currently serving as the President's Special Advisor for Inclusive Excellence. I also hold the Ron Calgard Distinguished Professor of Practice Chair in Political Science.
All right, thank you so much. So my first question is just kind of a broader question about the Texas midterms. And so I just wanted to see, what can you tell us about these midterms and how they will affect Texas going forward?
Yeah, so great question for us to start off with. Now, what's interesting is Texas was very different than the rest of the country. We'll talk about what happened nationally in a second in terms of a historic going against the historic trends. But in Texas stayed pretty red, right? And so the big race for governor, with Governor Abbott getting reelected, Beto O'Rourke kind of trying to take him on. But in the end, Beto ended up losing by 11 points. What's interesting for us here in Texas is also turnout was a little bit lower. Turnout is still high compared to the past, but it was a little bit lower than the midterm elections in 2018. But for us in Texas, what's an interesting really kind of statistic is, we've got over 17 million people who are registered to vote in Texas. A little bit over 8 million voted in the midterm elections. There are actually more people who are registered to vote who didn't vote in the midterm elections. So we still have a challenge in terms of participation. But the Republicans held. They won every statewide office. And Bexar County is a little bit different for us here in San Antonio. We're still kind of a bluish county. So Democrats kind of won here in the county. But when you think statewide, what it means for Texas politics, people were wanting to see whether Beto was going to be able to close the margin with Abbott. There was, in his second re-election, Governor Abbott beat a woman named Lupe Valdez, who was a former sheriff from Dallas County. Most people in Texas probably couldn't even tell you what her name was. She didn't have much money. She wasn't as organized as Beto was. And unfortunately for the Democrats, Beto losing by 11 points was comparable to what happened in the Valdez-Abbott race. So I think a lot of people were disappointed on the Democratic side that Texas wasn't getting closer to becoming blue. We're still a pretty red state. The other thing I mentioned to people about the Texas politics that got confirmed again in the midterm elections is it really depends on how we cut up the state. So if you look at the cities and the counties that are the big places in Texas, think of Harris County in Houston, Bexar County here in San Antonio, Austin and Travis, Dallas and Dallas County. In those big places, they're blue. So Beto was ahead by 500,000 votes if you just look at the cities and those big counties. When you move to the border, there was a lot of talk about the border where the Hispanic vote was going to move to the Republican Party. It didn't in Texas. It moved a little bit, but it was still kind of predominantly with Beto. When you go to some of the fast-changing counties, places like Tarrant, just out Fort Bend, just outside of Houston, Abbott started to then kind of defeat Beto, but the real thing in the rural areas. So when you look at the rural areas, Beto lost by about 1.5 million votes. So the 500,000 vote lead he had coming out of the cities just got crushed. And so even though these are smaller places, and when you think about the future of Texas politics, those numbers in the rural areas are getting smaller and smaller, but when you combine them, they are so red, so deep red. Beto got 24% of the rural votes. No Democratic candidate has gotten over 25% in decades. So until that changes for the Democratic Party, Texas is going to stay red for a while.
On a national level, you said that Texas is a little bit different from the rest of the country. So on the national level, how have the midterm results affected the Senate, and why is that significant?
So the Senate in particular, so the Democrats held on to the Senate. What's historic about what happened in the midterm elections outside of Texas, when we go back to the 1930s until 2018, it is rare, if you are the party in power and you control the House and the Senate, which has been true for Joe Biden and the Democrats, you lose. You lose seats in the midterm elections. That's just what happens. You usually lose about 32 seats. On average, you lose about 28 in the House and you lose about 4 in the Senate. And in more modern times, I was in the Obama administration, and in the first midterm election, we got killed, right? And so even in the more recent times, it's been anywhere from about 40 to 60 seats that you lose combined in the House and the Senate. What happened in the midterm elections nationally was the opposite. Democrats actually didn't lose anything in the Senate, and there's still one race to go in Georgia. So there's actually a potential for a pickup. They picked up one seat in Pennsylvania, All the other incumbents kind of held their seats. So at this point, the Democrats are at 50-49 because of the vice president. They have the tie that breaks, her vote breaks the tie, so they control the Senate. That's unheard of. And then on the House side, the Republicans just barely squeaked by. You need 218 to hold on to the House. They just got to 218. Right now it's 218 to 210 as we're kind of talking right now. There's about 7 races that are left. That's historic, right? I mean, this was an historic kind of victory for the Democrats with tough inflation, with huge, horrible disapproval ratings for Joe Biden. For us here in Texas, a lot of talk about immigration and other places around crime. All these issues where the Democratic Party really hasn't done well and the voters don't trust Democrats. But on midterm day, the Democrats held. So, I mean, that was a huge shock. Now, a lot of people, you know, these midterm elections from the White House compared to the other pieces, there's usually 2 times of elections. If you're the Republican Party, if you're out of power, you want it to be a referendum. Those guys are terrible. That Joe Biden, those Democrats, take them down. If you're the Democrats and you're in power, in this case it's the Democrats, you want it to be a choice. You don't want it to be, this is how I'm doing. You want to be a choice against something else. Former President Trump brought himself into the mix to make it a choice. And a lot of voters are like, what was interesting is there's a swing vote that kind of appeared in the midterm elections. And they were people who kind of somewhat disapprove of what's happening with Biden, and they still voted Democratic because they're saying that Republican stuff, the Trump portion in particular, is too extreme. So there were Republicans who believe more in the party than Trump who are like, I can't go that far. So even they lost a few votes there as well too. But overall, I think that was the huge thing that happened. It was that former President Trump was defeated by him inserting himself in the midterms. And for Joe Biden, even with low approval ratings, with a horrible kind of political environment, the Democrats were able to hold on.
In the House, what can you tell us about the election results?
So like I mentioned, everyone assumed because of historic trends and just also where the polling would show us kind of getting closer to a midterm day, that they talk about the red wave. People are talking about tsunamis, right? Talking about all this horrible kind of analogies to kind of how the Democrats were just going to get crushed. It didn't happen, right? So you went from a very small Democratic majority with Speaker Pelosi, the first female speaker that we've had in American history. The idea was that they were going to lose a ton of votes and the Republicans were going to take over. Kevin McCarthy from California would become the new speaker. Like I mentioned, it was just a few days ago that they hit the magic number of 218 with 7 seats to go, and they probably won't take all of them, but the biggest margin they'll have will be up to 7. So it was a tiny little margin, which means it's going to be tough for the Republicans to kind of hold on to control, but they have control. So that means, we all know that what that means is with a divided House, Americans don't like it when one party is totally in control all the time, and that's what usually happens in the midterm elections. So what you have now is that nothing's going to get done legislatively because the House will stop everything, and while the Democrats still hold on to the Senate will allow them to kind of get judicial appointments kind of through, but it's going to, I think most people think any notion of legislation is kind of done for the Biden administration. Now, because of this, the other really important piece is Speaker Pelosi, who's been an incredible speaker for the Democrats and the first woman and has been there for a really long time, just announced that she's stepping down from that position. So you also, the other impact of what's happened with the midterm elections, at least on the Democratic side, is you're going to see a generational change. There's a new set of leaders. Most of the leaders for the Democrats right now were in their 80s. So you're about to see folks not that much younger, but at least in their 50s, right, who are now going to take over. And what's interesting is that the leading candidates on the House side for leadership for the Democratic Party match kind of the diversity of the Democratic base. We're potentially about to have the first African-American Speaker of the House, Hakeem Jeffries from New York, in American history. There looks like there will be a female who will be a number 2. It looks like a number 3 who's a Latino, Pete Aguilar, coming out of California. So you're going to see a really diverse leadership team that's different from the Democratic side and younger because of what happened with the midterm elections. But from the Republican side, they're going to feel good about their ability to stop things on the legislative side for President Biden. And partly because the margin is so small, there's going to be more power with some of the more extreme right-wing House members. So you're going to see a lot of investigations, right, that they're going to be coming because they want to kind of go back after the Democrats for what they feel like they've come after them. So I'm sure Hunter Biden, the President Biden's son, they've talked about going after some of the cabinet members. So I think you're going to see a lot of investigative and oversight committees coming from the Republican side as well.
So then, you've talked now both about the House and the Senate, and a little bit about like how that's going to change on a national level. Here in Texas especially, like how might these results affect us moving forward?
Well, I think for Texas in particular, and for the country as a whole, from the federal level, there's going to be a standstill, right? Nothing's going to kind of get done, so things will kind of stay in place. Now, the other potential is we have Texans. John Cornyn, who is a Trinity grad, is in a leadership position. So with a tight Senate, even though the Republicans will still be in the minority position, John Cornyn will continue to have a leadership voice within the party. So I think that'll be a continuation of what happened for Texas, that you've got someone who's in power. Ted Cruz, I think, not so much the midterm elections, but I think some people think Ted Cruz is potentially going to be looking at another run for the presidency. I think, and so you start to also think about 2024, Governor Abbott, will potentially be looking at a run for the presidency. So you have some pretty important Texas elected officials who could jump into the national scene. You see, I think a lot of it, like I was mentioning, is a continuation. So for example, a few days ago, Governor Abbott has already been running something called Operation Lone Star, which is his notion of saying the federal government the Biden administration isn't doing and taking care of Texas and what's happening along the border. There's a lot of kind of debate about whether what he's doing is legal, but there is a clause within the Texas Constitution, in the federal Constitution, that says if you're a state and if you are being invaded, you can protect yourself. And so Governor Abbott put that out in a tweet, hey, Texas is being invaded. And I think a lot of the media actually, a number of folks were like, wait, did he just say that we're declared that there's an invasion of Texas? He didn't do it in a legal way, right? But he was using that to kind of say the federal government isn't taking care of this, even though responsibility for immigration lies at the federal level. They're trying to kind of say this is legitimate of what I'm doing. And a lot of us understand that whether it's legal, there's always a political angle. And so a lot of people say there's also a chance for him from the political side to get his name out, to kind of be provocative, to get his narrative out there, to try to get his name out there, that if he is going to be looking at a 2024 run, that's going to be happening. So it's more of that kind of political stuff. The actual impact on Texans, I think from the federal level, is going to stay about the same, just because things are locked in with a divided House and Senate. And then obviously at the state level, the midterm elections, you have a few more Republicans who've picked up seats in the House and one on the Senate side. So at the state level, the Republicans are going to continue to dominate the agenda. They've already started to put in their legislation. The Texas state legislature only meets every other year, but they've started to kind of put in their bills. So you're starting to see a lot of the identity issues that people were talking about in the campaign are actually now being filed as bills. So you're going to start to see a lot of that kind of continue from the Texas political side as well.
Okay. So looking at these effects, and then you mentioned the voter turnout this year, what do you have to say about the youth vote, and like why is that important? What did we see from it this midterm election?
Yeah, and I think people were surprised. There was a lot of talk that young people weren't going to show up, and young people did, right? So when we look at the 18 to 29-year-old age bracket, this was the second highest that the youth vote has been in the past few decades. Now, 2018 was a huge election for everybody. So in 2018, the youth vote was at 31%. It was at 27% this time. But in some of the key states where there were really important races going on, in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Georgia, Florida, a lot of number of places, you actually had a higher turnout of young people, probably at about that 31% level. So I think young people showed again that this was the second highest turnout they've ever had, kind of in the most recent kind of history in the past few decades. Surprising folks that, the youth folks aren't coming out. And for the Democratic Party, it's a big piece because they're strong. It's a strong Democratic vote. And when you break down the youth vote, even in terms of kind of race and ethnicity, the African American youth vote was pushing at 89%. The Latino vote was really high. Even the white youth vote kind of voted for the Democrats. And so when you look at age groups, right, 18 to 29, then the next one that's kind of 29 up into the 40, a little bit Democratic. Every other group favors the Republicans. So for the future of the Democratic Party, they love that young people kind of came out. And I think it countered that message that young people don't care, they're not involved. They actually turned out and actually were a critical factor in a number of the key races for the Democrats. And so that was a huge plus, I think, that people were really happy to kind of see. And we're kind of hoping that that's going to be kind of a constant kind of moving forward as well.
And then my last question here, wrapping up. So looking back at all of these results, still waiting on a few, would you say that these midterm results were expected and predicted, or kind of like complete opposite of what?
Just complete opposite, right? So there was expectations of a red wave, and it did not happen, right? And so it was a huge victory for the Democrats, historic for Joe Biden. But at the same time, the exit polling was telling us, look, this did become a choice election, and we're not crazy about the Trump wing of the party. That scares us with democracy and so many other issues. But at the same time, it was not, Democrats have to be careful. You don't want to read too much into it, because this wasn't kind of saying, we're on board with your agenda. Because there's still huge disapproval ratings for the president. He's below where past presidents have been. There's still, inflation's getting a little bit better, but there's still that question of how people are what's going to happen in terms of inflation. Some people think crime is up in their areas. So there's some really tough issues. And in most of those issues, the voters were actually saying they think that the Republicans are better at those issues than the Democrats, but they still voted for the Democrats because they thought the Republicans and the Trump portion of the party was too extreme. So in a strange way, the voters kind of came out and said, we're against this, but we're not 100% board on that, which I think is good, because that means the Biden administration, the Democratic Party, is going to have to work hard to hold on to those voters when Trump just announced, right? So he's going to run again. So we'll have to see whether he wins the primary or not. But if he is still around, that helps the Democrats. But at the end of the day, you have to be able to move your agenda. And so I think that's probably the trickiest piece that people are still trying to figure out. There are a number of political scientists who look at these elections and they look at the trends, right? And a lot of this is analysis, but they look at data. So there's a book that just came out called The Bitter End. It's a number of political scientists who do this every 4 years. They interview about 500,000 voters. And what they've talked about is the three big trends that are continuing. The first trend is that the parties are further apart from each other than ever before. And within the parties, they're homogenous. You don't have liberal Republicans, and you really don't have very conservative Democrats. They're a little bit more like each other, but further apart from each other. It's almost equal. Even though the Democrats did an incredible, and it was an historic kind of victory, the races were tight, right? So when the races, so there's partisan equity. If there's about the same number of Republicans as there are Democrats, you don't have to change, right? And so when I was in the Obama administration, when we defeated Mitt Romney in that in the re-election, the Republicans were like, we need to have an autopsy. Wow, what did we do wrong? We need to figure out how to do something different. Nowadays, you don't. Biden won the presidency by less than 40,000 votes in 3 battleground states. Trump defeated Hillary Clinton by a little less than 80,000 votes in 3 battleground states. So they're like, it's tight. I just need to get a few folks on board. I don't need to do anything really differently. Now we'll see if the midterms changes the Republicans' mind. And then the final piece is where so much of the past used to be about big government or small government, identity issues around race and ethnicity. Think about the abortion issue and pro-choice. Think about issues around transgender kids. Think about critical race theory. There's a lot of these things that have become identity issues that have become more important, especially on the Republican side, but it's also become really important on the Democratic side. And those are issues that make people even more polarized. So the rise of those identity issues at the same time that you've got parity, that the parties are more distant, makes the politics calcified and kind of stuck. So a lot of people are saying, how do we break through that? Because the polarization is not good for the country. And I think a lot of people are going to be trying to figure out what we can do to change that piece, and that's going to be tough.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. Is there anything else you would like to say before we wrap up?
The final thing I'll say is that I want to give a big shout out to our folks on campus who were part of the Trinity Voter Engagement Project. I've been a part of it. We've got some great students and the faculty and staff who've been kind of involved and did a great job of getting our students to the polls, and we've been recognized nationally, right? So it's not just kind of like, it's the data matters, right? And so I think that's something we should be really proud of, that our students, the professors, the faculty, the staff have all kind of gotten together to show how important it is, especially the students. And we've gotten national recognition for it that once again I think just shows what a great job we're doing here. So I wanted to say congratulations to all our students in particular for kind of helping Trinity get to the top of the list and playing our role as responsible citizens within the process as well.